Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Deeks channel here. And we're going to get into some fun stuff today. My friend Kyle is joining me from Hockey Night in Canada and 32 Thoughts, the podcast. And Kyle, we're going to talk about the Four Nations tournament, your first taste of international best on best, something you in your career experience, I think, unless you cover the World Cup of hockey. I could be wrong. We'll get to that in a second, but we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, I'm going to ask Kyle what he thinks about Sam Bennett to the Montreal Canadiens, maybe in the offseason. Maybe. We'll see. But we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff here, guys. But, Kyle, this tournament, I don't know if under promise, over deliver is the best way to describe it in terms of, I don't know what everybody expected because I didn't know how much people were going to care about this tournament, but man, it was something, and I'm sure you got some stuff to share from your side of things.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest thing. Like there really wasn't a promise going in. We didn't know what to expect. Like even flying into Montreal a couple days before the first game, everyone got in, and I don't think we had a sense of what this was going to be like because it had been so long and it was a format we haven't seen before. It was short in the middle of the season. There wasn't really, we thought anything on the line. It's not an Olympics. It's not a World Cup, but they did put together a fairly nice looking trophy for this thing. But that first practice in Brassard, as everyone came out watching, so Canada was the first group out there, and you see Crosby and McDavid and McKinnon and McCarr, and they're all wearing the same colors. It was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like you're feeling like it's been way too long since we've seen this. You got basically an entire generation of hockey fans that have only seen that prior to that event on their TV screens playing EA Sports NHL. It's the only time until this last couple of weeks between Montreal and Boston. So that was like, all right, cool. And then the next day was media day, and on kind of the main event level at Bell Center there's just down from where the media work area was set up and all the interview pods, they had kind of like a photograph car wash set up for the players to do. Like that was where, the infamous Brock Nelson photo, like all those pictures were taken where they're in their gear. And you could just see, like, we were standing there watching some of the teams come out, and some of them were just like, looking kind of going like, wow, like I'm wearing a Team USA jersey or I'm got my Team Canada gear on. Like the looks on their faces kind of told you like this is meaningful to them. Like this isn't just another all-star type thing. I didn't think it was going to be an all-star type level, anything comparable. Like for those that were like, this is a glorified all-star, it's just exhibition, I didn't think it was going to be that. I had no idea, of course, I don't know anyone did other than the players perhaps, that it was going to be to this kind of pace and intensity. And I think that's why, like, the players get all of the credit here. I mean, good on the NHL for finally going, we should have something like this again. It had been 9 years just about. And organizing the fact that it was in Montreal and Boston. Like, I'm not sure if you could have picked better spots in terms of venues and cities, weather aside, of course. But but it was all the players. It was all the players. The moment they decided this means everything effectively to us, that pulled everyone else in, right? Like you can just see the way they went about things and how good the hockey was. You had no choice but to be like, wow, now I want to watch because this is some of the most breathtaking hockey we've seen in quite some time. And just this collection of, this era of the best players in the world. We just haven't seen this yet. So for all those reasons, like it was spectacular, and why it blew everybody's, whatever the expectations were going in, completely blew it out of the water, and completely changed the conversation around the appetite for events like this going forward.
Yeah, no kidding. Like I remember, because it's been since 2017 that Montreal Canadiens have seen them with a full building in the playoffs.
Right.
We're talking a better part of 8 years, and you could just tell the hunger in that first game. It was Canada and Sweden, and the roar from the crowd when they knew Canada was getting their first power play and that McKinnon goal, just knowing they were getting to see the power play, like it was an eruption. I don't know if
Yes.
you heard that from rinkside too. Like what was that
Oh,
first
yeah.
what was that first game like?
Yeah, it was well, it was, as you say, like it was just nice, nice to talk Team Canada here for a while. It was almost a a refresher for me, as the gates opened and the fans made their way in and everyone's wearing Team Canada jerseys, right? Like, I'm just like, oh, it's been a while since I've seen this. Now, of course, we have the World Juniors in that, but in this type of stage, it's like, oh yeah, it's great to see those jerseys out. Dusted off from the closet after much too long that they were kept inside. So that was neat. Obviously, when we were told in the afternoon, like, hey, they've got Mario Lemieux to come in to be
Yeah,
part of the pregame ceremonies. And I was like, oh, really? Because we haven't seen him for a while. You know what I mean? Like, even
right.
for years, you saw him in Pittsburgh, right? Like part of the ownership group. And now with Fenway Sports in the picture there, you just haven't seen him around Penguin games in a public setting like we have in the past. We just like, we haven't seen him in a long time. And so for him to agree to come to that, obviously, as we saw later on, the neat moment of him reading the starting lineups out in the Canada dressing room. But when his name was introduced in that building, just it was unhinged in all the best ways. So like the crowd was ready, like to your
Yeah.
point, like they were ready. And when that first arm went up for the first penalty of the game, it was like, oh yeah, now we get this. And even in overtime too, like as soon as they Canada took back possession and like McKinnon had the puck on his stick and he's 180 feet from the Swedish goal, the crowd were like, like it was like, oh my God, this could be it. Like there was such anticipation because it had been so long and just an incredible collection of players all in one team. But I said this on the podcast with Elliot, like, as much as certainly, as you say, Andrew, like the Canadian fans, Montreal Canadian fans, like they know the deal there in that building. It's always a special night to go see a game there. But even more so when you've got a game of great significance. And you mentioned how long it's been since a full building in the playoffs there in Montreal. But you talk to some of the fans that were there, particularly like that Saturday game against the U.S. And it's like, hey, where are you from? I'm from Calgary. Hey, where are you from? I'm from Moncton. Hey, where are you from? I'm from St. John's, Newfoundland. Hey, where are you from? I'm from Vancouver. Grew up in Victoria. And then there's people that came up from the stateside too. So it wasn't just the hardcore Quebec fan locals that were there. People from all over North America. And you could say, there's definitely those that came from across the pond too, cheering on Sweden and Finland. But my point is, there's something about that arena, Andrew. Like when you walk in, when your ticket is scanned, that just it puts you into a different place. Like it there's something runs through your body, and there's an understanding that like when you go to a game there and it matters, it's just something that takes over you, and it just adds to the atmosphere of the whole place. It's really, really special.
And that's an atmosphere that, like, you've been to many Saturday night games in Montreal. Like you've seen a few exciting regular season games there. The home opener comes to mind that you and I were both at. I didn't get a chance to bump into you that night, but when Josh Anderson scored like a couple of years ago with like 17 seconds
Mm-hmm.
left against Toronto, that was a fun night. That was great. But the game itself was kind of so-so. I mean, from puck drop for this tournament. So to me, it was a testament of, because I heard Stu Cowan say not that long ago from the Montreal Gazette, this is not just like it's you got the Montreal Alouettes, you had the Montreal Impact for a while, they're being popular or whatnot. The Expos at one point, the Montreal Canadiens, they've brought in the World Junior Tournament at another point as well. But he was saying, this is not just like not a hockey city, it's a Montreal Canadian city. But then this tournament comes along, and it's like, okay, it's a hockey city again because it was about more than just the Canadians. And like you said, everyone coming from everywhere to experience that in that building. I was proud of the fact that the Bell Center was chosen as the host because, to me, they over delivered for Team Canada. That was truly unique.
Yeah, that was. You could just tell the players were like in such awe of what they were playing in front of.
Mm,
Like that added to everything. Um, and just going back to the idea of like how much it mattered to them that this was like a success and that the hockey was really great. So we interviewed, Dylan Larkin after the US beat Canada on the Saturday night in Montreal. And so he comes over to our interview position in the hallway, and before we start, like he comes up and I've gotten to know Dylan a little bit over the years. I think he's a super guy. I've got a lot of time for him.
Hmm.
And he turns to me, he goes, "So what'd you think?" And I'm like, "What I think? Like, it was the most incredible night I've ever experienced. Like, what do you mean, what do I think?" But it just spoke volumes to them, where they're like, they wanted it to be great. And they're like, well, I'm sure they felt like this is incredible. Obviously for the Americans that night, like what a special evening, how wired they were to take one off Canada in their building. Um, and so it was just but there was like that feeling of we thought that was really cool, like hopefully everyone else did too, and yeah, everyone else did too.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Canada US game because we're all at home just like, wait, what? The puck has dropped and they're already they're fighting? Like what's going
Yeah.
on? Like so like is everybody standing in the Bell Center? Like what's going through all your guys' minds, because it wasn't one fight, it was two and then it was three. Like that was obviously, we heard it was maybe premeditated by the Kachuk brothers or whatnot, but like, man, like describe that moment of the start of that game. That was otherworldly almost.
Yeah, it was like somehow it won up to opening night against Sweden, and because you thought that couldn't be topped. But I remember as a kid watching, when I went through phase of a couple years where I was big into WWE wrestling, and
Yes. Me
there
too.
was yeah, and there
Attitude
was
era,
a
baby.
right, and so just kind of coming out of that. So now we're talking 2005 and summer of 2005, and Shawn Michaels and Hulk Hogan were a tag team for a while, and then Michaels turns on Hogan, and it sets up for SummerSlam. They're going to be the main event, Hogan versus Michaels. Anyway, along the lead up to that, there's a Monday Night Raw in Montreal at the Bell Center.
Ooh.
And Michaels comes out, and you can look this up on YouTube, Andrew, if you haven't seen it. It's one of the best promos cut, I think, in WWE history. So he comes out into the ring, and like you can imagine, everyone's all over Shawn when he
Yep.
walks out, because what happened in Montreal a few years prior to that, right? That involved Shawn Michaels, the screw job with Bret Hart. Anyway,
Yes.
so Shawn's doing his thing, and you just like, you knew that he knew, and everybody knew that the crowd would eventually get to this point, because he's milking it. He's twisting the knife into the Canadiens. He's mocking the Canadian anthem, talking about what he's going to do to Hulk Hogan at SummerSlam. And then eventually, the crowd turns and they start chanting like, "You screwed Brett, you screwed Brett." And so then he's like, he starts to take that on, and he's playing into that. And he's like, "I did screw Brett." And you could tell even at one point, he looks into the camera and does this as like a sign to the production truck going, "Let me keep going with this a little bit here. Like the crowd's too good."
Okay.
Anyways, the point of all this was eventually he gets to the point where he's like, if Bret the Hitman Hart, was this, that, and the other. Anyway, and then like Bret Hart's music plays out of nowhere, like his music hits, and the pop. I remember watching that on TV, and like the crowd was so deafening. Even though like I remember I was lying on like my parents' bed, like on my stomach, watching on the TV in their bedroom, and like how loud the crowd was that night for that pop. And it ended up all being like, of course, Bret Hart wasn't there. It ended up being all part of the shtick.
Yeah, I forgot for a
But
second. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, I just remember thinking like that was like one of the loudest pops I'd ever heard in my years watching wrestling.
Right.
And sure enough, 20 years later, just about in that same building, like the pop when the first face-off happened, and Hagel and Matthew Tkachuk dropped the gloves. I had never heard that before, like in person.
Mm.
And like I was saying this morning, like I almost got like emotional, like not that I cared one way or another over what happened, but just like this eruption that you're in the middle of, it just like takes over you. Like I'm like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe what I'm seeing here. It was like I remember growing up, of course, on the West Coast, the first time I saw a killer whale breach come fully out of the ocean, like
Oh.
all the way. And I remember I was like, I got emotional watching that. I was like, this is incredible. And for whatever reason, it was similar feelings watching this whole scene Saturday night in Montreal, because it was just it was organic as much as, I'm sure. Yeah, as we learned afterwards, the group chat there with the Kachucks and JT Miller about, wanting to set a tone here early. But really on the outside, nobody saw this coming with how it started. And so that was just it was cool. It was cool. For everyone that says that, fighting's got to go, and the premeditated ones, I'm all for. I don't have much time for, but just in a moment like that, and acknowledging kind of the stage, and that was all. Like, I'm not backing down from him, and I'm doing it for our team, and for the country. Like, that was pretty neat.
Yeah, I mean, like, as I'm just a big proponent of, like, as long as nobody gets hurt, like, have at it, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, I'm always kind of like,
Yeah,
but then
exactly.
the Kachucks are hurt now, so I don't know if it's from the fights, but that's another sidebar, I guess, too.
No, no, you're right. And I mean, and they weren't the only ones that got injuries out of it.
Right, right.
Certainly I don't believe the, Brady's injury it was related to what happened there on Saturday.
Yeah.
But I mean, hopefully, I think they're pretty optimistic that he could play Wednesday here against Winnipeg. But yeah, like, that was the other thing too, where Ellie and I discussed, where I'm like, especially going in, Petrangelo had pulled out, and everyone was like, well, like, and then Quinn Hughes doesn't play, and it was like, well, why is our top guys going? Like, there's a playoff run here to worry about. This is a mean nothing event. Like, why is this being something that the players would actually go risk injury for? Now we see why, of course, but just the timing of it. And my point to Elliot was, like, if they're going to keep doing this, like, you can't keep having this issue of doing it in February, and it's the push and pull of, well, is it worth it, when now you're missing time because with your club team, and especially if you're in a situation where you could be headed to the playoffs and maybe even a chance at winning it all, and what's the balance there? But the trade-off of doing it in February, like, the timing could not have been better for the NHL, where you're post Super Bowl. It was happened to coincide with the NBA All-Star weekend that was ripped to shreds. So I can see why, from that perspective, doing that over September and not making the season any longer than it already is. But yeah, the injury thing is a serious one. I saw Paul Maurice today. It looks like he could be out a while. Matthew Tkachuk, but Maurice did say he's going to play for us again this year. So that could add some intrigue. If this is an LTI scenario here for Florida, I mean, you teased some Sam Bennett ideas here earlier, but now with the Panthers here potentially having a little more room, if that is the case, how they end up optimizing it will be really fascinating here to watch. But yeah, the injury thing, like, it was, at that level, at that pace, like, there was going to be, I don't want to say casualties, but there was going to be some moments there where guys get dinged up. It was
Yeah.
unfortunate for a guy like Shea Theodore too. It's just it comes with playing at that level and that intensity.
Right. Now, I mean, we could talk about a lot of these players' performances. I mean, Jordan Bennington, wow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who to compare it to, but when he made those saves in overtime I guess, yeah, I was going to call it the gold medal game. I guess it kind of was, because they did get medals. I was like, are they getting medals too? And the trophy?
Yeah.
They did.
Yes, they did.
So, but when he made those saves, I think it was like my first realization. I'm like, I think we're going to win this. And, but all the storylines going in about the whole Canada US thing and whatnot, and it was a very patriotic event. It's kind of a two-part question. I think I'll start with this one, just because I just listened to the pod with you and Elliot from Friday right after the game. How big was this for the growth of the game of hockey? Because Elliot was saying that you got to get kids on skates. It's one of the most expensive sports to play. So how do we get kids on skates that want to skate? So how big was this tournament, do you think, in terms of its reach to inspire more kids and just to grow the game of hockey in general?
Yeah, I believe, obviously, the reach was incredible. Like, the amount of people you're not used to seeing weigh in on this sort of stuff, and to be interested and engaged is enormous. And you imagine, yeah, I think certainly, obviously, here in Canada, I mean, hockey's a big talking point, and it's tough to avoid even to the quietest of times. But just with the political climate the way it is right now, like, just there was a lot of kind of rallying around the flag. over
Yeah.
the course of that event. And so I imagine like that all adds to it too. Like we all had our, I think growing up, our international moments, right? Like of a certain vintage, it was 72 or 87. '02 was for me in Salt Lake. Certainly
Yep.
2010, of course. And for, the next wave of kids, like it'll be watching McDavid score the overtime winner last week in Boston. But in terms of actually growing the game, like I'm with Elliot, like the cost until that changes, Andrew, like I'm not sure where we're going here. Like if we're really talking, it's one thing about expanding the popularity of the NHL and have more people talk about it, but on a grassroots level, until the cost and that can be addressed, and I'm not sure how you do it. Like I really don't. Like I would love to see a scenario where it can become more affordable. And certainly there are a lot of programs out there that are targeted towards, those that are less fortunate and just don't have the funds to be able to, get kids in equipment and to help subsidize some things that way, which is fantastic. But Andrew, like it's funny, like it's as much as the game has made some strides, it's not perfect, but it certainly has made strides and being, more inclusive of people of different backgrounds, and beliefs and such, and being like you're more than welcome to be part of this, which is great. I think with that, as the costs have gone up, now you've got, other groups of society that were once part of this great sport that now can't, because they're going, we can't afford this anymore. Like just the cost is not is too much, which is really too bad. So until that can get addressed, like if you really want to talk about the growth of the sport, from a grassroots level, it's tough. I mean, I understand at the highest levels, the elite level hockey, there's going to be a big price tag from that, and I mean that's a whole other discussion and headache there, Andrew. But just for the ability to play rec hockey and to experience the sport, I think there's still, again, like, I wonder now over the next 20-30 years, like the synthetic ice, like you think about like just even things like now, like that, like training facilities that have, it's a basically treadmill for being on skates. You know what I mean? Like the technology has come so far that you can do things like that. Can you not set up areas where you're on synthetic ice? So the cost of, maintaining frozen ice, natural ice isn't, it's not part of the conversation anymore. That can be one thing. I mean, obviously, you don't always have to be on ice. There's inline hockey. There's different ways you can play the sport too, road hockey. But I think that, yeah, it always comes back to cost, Andrew. And I know that's the age old conversation with this stuff. And unfortunately, like it just seems to have gotten more expensive. The more we talk about it, needs to be more affordable. The reality has just gone the other way.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, I will vouch for Elliot and what he said with ball hockey because that's how I stay playing the game affordable for me anyway. But
Yeah.
that's to me like ball hockey's a blast. It's cheap. We wear shin pads at one point recently were optional. They finally made them mandatory, and helmets too. But I just got a bucket. Before that, it was shin pads, gloves, and a stick. Man, I mean, like that's it. So
Yeah.
I encourage that, and I think that's one of the better ways to play. I just have a blast. We have ball hockey's like my thing. It's like the one thing I'm still doing. So
Yeah.
it's fun.
Right. Right. So stuff like that, making that an option, like is great. I mean, we've got now just down from where we live, there's like a community ODR, and there's a couple guys in the neighborhood that do a really incredible job maintaining the ice. It's busy with kids on there every day. That's great. But I know, like for me, where I grew up in Vancouver Island, like we didn't have that. It didn't get cold enough long enough to have just an ODR that you could go rip around in after
Mhm.
school and such. So when those are available, it's great. But as you know, like not everybody has the opportunity to do so. So it's always a balance, and there's always going to be some roadblocks. But yeah, it's going to be a conversation that's not going anywhere for a long time. It's just, yeah, it's one of those sports where there's a lot that goes into it. As you mentioned, like on the simplest form of something like ball hockey, yes, like it's a lot less cost, because there's a lot less equipment. But when you're thinking of 5-on-5 playing organized hockey in the wintertime at the local rink, now you're adding in a lot more factors.
Right. True enough. Just want to ask you a couple more real quick before we head out. But I mentioned the Sam Bennett conversation. Of course, you look around here, like what team do I cheer for usually, right?
Yeah, yeah,
You guys all know who that is. But I guess from that tournament, for me as a Habs fan, looking at free agency, we have not been buyers in free agency. I can't remember. I think it was 2017 in the playoff round when they brought in Dwight King and Martinson and Steve Ott, or is it Steve
Yes.
Orr?
No,
Ott.
Steve Ott. Yeah,
Okay.
Steve Ott. Yeah.
So I mean, Kyle, what do you think of? I think there would be a lot of suitors for Sam Bennett. I think Florida, if you're Florida, you want to keep winning, you want to keep a guy like that and re-sign him. But he's the player that really stood out for like the Montreal end of things. But I suspect that Kent Hughes would definitely want to make a pitch with a lot more salary cap space this summer to a player like him because he would really fit in, I think, really well potentially with the next step with Demidov coming in for the Canadiens. I just think that with possibly Evans, Armia, Dvorak all being gone, they're going to have to replace some of these forwards. So I just thought that he stood out as a guy that you'd really want to go after. Chris Nyland, I know, was on board with that, but I just thought I'd run that one by you from seeing his game.
Yeah, I mean, like if you're a Canadiens fan, like you just watched him play for Canada, and that's what he is. Like, not backing down from anything. You saw him, in the fight there. He's a fearless competitor, and he's also got great touch too. Like the tying goal against the US in tight there, going up and over the shoulder of Hellebuck. Like there's some really incredible offensive instincts to his game there also. So how can you not be a fan of his and picture him? Like there's not a lot of places, not a lot of scenarios around the league where you're going, I'm not sure Sam Bennett fits here, right? Like he is the type of player that a lot of teams would want. So with that, of course, there's going to be some competition if a team like Montreal were to inquire. I imagine, I don't know, unless you've got the guarantee that you can acquire him now and sign him long term. Then you explore making that move. But with the fact that he's going to be a UFA here this summer,
I'm thinking more UFA than trade, but
right.
but
So right, and so the thing is just it's about the competition, right?
yeah, yeah.
And who knows? And as you say, like I mean, team like Florida, like why wouldn't you want to try to do everything you could to keep him around? Like that's going to be a real interesting one to watch because he's up this year. So too is Aaron Ekblad. And as much as the cap's going up, there's only so much money to go around there. So that's going to be a fascinating one with Bill Zito and how they decide to stick handle both of those two guys. But I could absolutely see Montreal being interested. And then there's the Toronto factor too, where I mean, they're all year they've been trying to find depth at center. That would be a complete game changer for them. But again, making the money work. And obviously knowing his ties to Toronto, being an Ontario guy, how much does that factor into giving the Leafs an edge there? It's a lot to consider. And with that, like you just know he's going to be someone that's going to command a lot of attention if it gets to the point, if Florida lets it get to the point that he's going to go to market. So I think it would be foolish for the Canadiens not to look into something like that. You can just know that there's going to be a lot of interest around the league for someone like him if it got to that stage.
All right, last question for you, and this will circle back to Four Nations. You guys as Canadians, I mean, I'm sure you're gonna have to tread lightly just because, I mean, you work on television and you're supposed to be unbiased and, you know, but I always want to get your thoughts, no pun intended, and Elliot's, of course, but as Canadians, I mean, I'm not saying like, hey, like, were you guys fist pumping after, Canada won? I imagine it was professional and you guys took it in as it came at you. But I mean, between all the Canadians involved, maybe even the Americans, I don't know. But what was that sort of feeling like amongst the Canadian, broadcasters, player, everybody, like yourselves, when Canada won? Did it like how can you put that into words? I guess when you're trying to be professional and also being a proud Canadian.
Yeah, I get it. It's a great question. I mean, I think I was happy for Canadians. Can I put it that way? I was really happy
So
for
you're
them.
happy for you too, then?
Yeah, I mean, like, but again, like it was such a thrill to cover. Like I would have been, I could have lived with either result. Like it was another fantastic game. Like there was no dud of that whole event. There were
Hmm.
no duds. The
Hmm.
third period, USA Finland on the Thursday night. That was the only one that kind of got away from us. Um, so I was happy for the Canadians watching. And so that's kind of how I felt. Because in the moment, like you're just so You're trying to process everything. Like we're in kind of a holding area in the back hall because it was overtime, waiting. Okay, who's going to score, and then you've got to get to their bench, and who are you going to interview? There's a whole lineup of rights holders in an event like that. ESPN, because it was in the States, like they're the head of the snake. They decide, okay, we want to interview this person, and then there's a trickle down from there. So there's a lot of logistics to sort out, right? And okay,
Okay.
who's going where? You're going to go on the bench. You're going to stand over there. So that's where my mind is at in the moment. We're watching on like a small monitor in the back hallway when the goal is scored. So we see initially like what happened. Oh, it's McDavid. So initially my thought, and I of course wasn't the only one back there. It was like, oh my God, like of all people, very much a storybook type finish.
Hmm.
So that's where my mind was kind of then. And then, you're just trying to process, and it was like, my gosh, like, so Crosby had his goal. I know it's different. It was the Olympics, but like he had his overtime moment for Canada 15 years ago. Now he's still playing. And like Connor, the guy that he idolized, he scores. Um, those are the sorts of things I think about kind of in the immediate aftermath. And then once it's all done and you kind of do a bit of a debrief and decompress, then you're like, yeah, like that was cool. And again, like understanding the political climate and like everything that was going on that made it the perfect storm for why so many were interested in that game and the outcome. Yeah, I was happy for Canada. I thought John Cooper put it really well. Like just like Canada needed a win here,
Yeah.
and they got one.
Yeah. No doubt. Well, with that, my friend, I will say thank you for jumping on, of course, and I'm always proud to see you, pop up on TV when you do, and just to see you get to do your thing, and it's one thing to get to talk to the players all the time, and that's your job, and you're kind of used to it, right? But to take in something like this that was fresh, and I'm sure it's going to live in your memory for a long time as a very big career highlight. And I don't know, will you get to go to Italy next year for the Olympics? Or do you have any sense of that at this stage? Sportsnet, I imagine, would go there, I would think.
I have no idea if I'm going. Like I think they've still got to sort out. I think they're still sorting out how that's all gonna look and work. But
Fair
I
enough.
haven't told anything.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, again, I do thank you for coming on as always, Kyle. Always a privilege. And thank you guys for watching, of course, and hit like on the video, hit subscribe if you can. Check out Kyle and 32 Thoughts, the podcast with Elliot Friedman. And of course, on Saturday nights, Hockey Night in Canada. Kyle loves his job. We love watching him do it. And we appreciate you guys watching. So thank you very much. And we'll see you guys real soon.